Our other top stories this evening, it's the end of an era in Solano County. The country's largest beer company is closing its last Bay Area brewing facility. Anheuser-Busch is shutting down operations in Fairfield. Here's NBC's Jody Hernandez.
Shock and surprise. Just very sad for my coworkers and sad for everybody that's already retired.
Some developing news. Anheuser-Busch is shutting down multiple facilities, including their Budweiser plant in Fairfield. Thank you for joining us at 5. I'm Andrea Flores.
I'm Lisa Gonzalez. 2 other plants are also being sold or shut down by the company, and that includes facilities in Newark, New Jersey and Merrimack, New Hampshire.
Imagine waking up one morning and realizing America's most iconic beer brand is suddenly in trouble, not because Americans stopped drinking it, but because an entire continent just said no to U.S. products. This isn't about taste. This isn't about politics on paper. This is about money, jobs, and power. Across Africa, governments and buyers are quietly turning away from American imports, choosing local producers and new global partners instead. And now, one of America's biggest beer brands is feeling the heat. Factories are watching export orders stall. Distributors are nervous. Investors are asking one uncomfortable question. Is this the beginning of a wider rejection of U.S. products? Because if Africa keeps the door closed, this won't stop at beer. It could hit corn farmers, truck drivers, dock workers, everyday Americans who never voted on any of this. So how did it get here? Why is Africa pushing back now? And what does this mean for the future of American brands overseas? Stay with me, because what's happening next could reshape global trade faster than anyone in Washington expected. When people hear the word beer, they usually think about sports nights, backyard barbecues, and familiar labels that have been around for generations. But behind every bottle is a massive global system of farmers, factories, shipping routes, trade agreements, and political decisions that most consumers never see. And today, that hidden system is under pressure in a way that few Americans expected. For decades, American brands expanded confidently across the world. Africa, with its fast-growing population and rising consumer markets, was seen as a long-term opportunity. U.S. companies exported not just finished products, but influence brands became symbols of lifestyle, modernity, and global connection. Beer was no exception. Major American brewers invested heavily in supply chains, marketing, and partnerships across African markets, believing demand would only grow. But something has changed. Across multiple African countries, a quiet shift has been taking place. Governments are rethinking import dependence. Local producers are demanding protection. Consumers are increasingly choosing homegrown alternatives, and trade officials are asking hard questions about why foreign products should dominate shelves when domestic industries are struggling to compete. This is not a single announcement or one dramatic press conference. It is a gradual tightening, new regulations here, preferential contracts there, currency controls, higher tariffs, local content rules, policies that taken individually look manageable but together create serious pressure for foreign exporters. For America's biggest beer brands, the impact is no longer theoretical. Beer exports rely on more than just brewing. They depend on you. As corn and barley farmers, aluminum can manufacturers, glass producers, logistics companies, shipping ports, insurers, and distributors. When exports slow down, the ripple effect travels far beyond the brewery floor. A reduction in overseas orders can mean excess inventory, lower production schedules, delayed investments, and eventually, job cuts. Africa's growing preference for local and non-U.S. products hits at a sensitive moment. Global competition in beverages has intensified. European, Asian, and regional African brands are expanding aggressively, often backed by governments that see food and drink industries as strategic assets. In some cases, African nations are partnering with foreign investors to build local breweries, keeping profits and employment at home instead of abroad. From the African perspective, this shift is framed as economic independence. For years, critics argued that importing finished goods drained foreign currency, limited industrial growth, and left local producers unable to scale. Supporting domestic beer production means supporting farmers who grow grains locally, technicians who run factories, and small businesses that distribute and sell the product. It also means greater control over pricing and supply during economic shocks. From the American perspective, however, the picture looks very different. Executives see markets that were once open becoming unpredictable. Long-term projections no longer feel secure. Contracts are harder to renew. Marketing campaigns deliver weaker returns. In boardrooms, the question is no longer how fast African markets will grow, but how much access U.S. brands will retain at all. This pressure comes at a time when American manufacturers are already facing rising costs. Energy prices fluctuate, raw materials face supply disruptions, shipping routes are more expensive and less reliable than they were a few years ago. When overseas demand softens, companies have fewer buffers to absorb shocks. Investors notice these signals quickly. Even rumors of declining export access can affect stock confidence. Analysts begin to ask whether certain regions should still be considered growth drivers or written down as high-risk markets. Once that narrative starts, it becomes difficult to reverse. What makes Africa's shift especially significant is scale. Africa is not one market, it is dozens of countries, each with its own policies, but increasingly similar goals. As regional trade blocs strengthen and cross-border cooperation increases, decisions made in one country influence others. A successful local industry in one nation becomes a model for its neighbors. This is how momentum builds. For American beer brands, the fear is not a single rejection but normalization. If choosing non-US products becomes the default, regaining lost ground could take years if it happens at all. Brand loyalty is powerful, but only when products are consistently present and competitively priced. Meanwhile, consumers in Africa are developing stronger attachments to local labels. These brands are marketed not just as cheaper alternatives but as symbols of national pride and economic progress. Drinking local becomes a statement, and once a brand becomes part of cultural identity, foreign competitors struggle to displace it. Back in the United States, the consequences are easy to overlook until they are not. A slowdown in exports does not immediately show up at the grocery store, but over time it influences employment decisions, capital investment, and political pressure. Farmers notice reduced demand for crops used in brewing. Transport companies see fewer long-haul shipments. Ports handle less outbound cargo. Communities built around manufacturing feel the strain quietly, one contract at a time. This is where trade tensions move from abstract policy debates to real-life impact. American policymakers often assume that access to foreign markets is permanent, secured by long-standing relationships and economic influence. Africa's current direction challenges that assumption. It suggests a world where emerging markets are no longer passive consumers, but active architects of their own economic strategies. The beer industry becomes a case study not because beer is essential, but because it is symbolic. If a product is globally recognized as American, beer can face resistance. What does that say about other exports? Processed foods, agricultural goods, consumer brands, technology-linked products that rely on the same trade routes and political goodwill. Critics inside the U.S. argue that this is a warning sign, that ignoring local development goals abroad eventually leads to backlash. Others counter that protectionist policies abroad distort markets and hurt consumers. The debate is far from settled, but one thing is clear: the era of easy expansion is over for African governments. The calculation is strategic. Short-term price increases may occur, some imports may disappear, but the long-term vision is industrial capacity, job creation, and economic resilience. Whether these goals will be fully achieved remains to be seen, but the direction is unmistakable. For American beer brands, adaptation is the only option. Some are exploring deeper localization, brewing inside Africa rather than exporting finished products. Others are forming joint ventures or sourcing more inputs locally to meet regulatory requirements. These moves reduce resistance, but also reduce control and margins. And even these strategies come with uncertainty. Local competition is fierce. Political environments shift. Currency risks remain. There are no guarantees. What we are witnessing is not a collapse, but a squeeze, a tightening of space that once felt unlimited. A reminder that global trade is not static and influence must be maintained, not assumed. The question now is how far this trend will go. Will Africa's preference for local and alternative partners spread deeper into consumer markets? Will U.S. brands successfully reinvent their presence? Or will this moment be remembered as the point when American exporters realized that the world had changed quietly, steadily, and without asking permission? Beer may seem like a small piece of the global economy, but sometimes the smallest signals reveal the biggest shifts, and right now the signal is clear. Access is no longer guaranteed, and global brands are learning that rejection does not always arrive loudly sometimes. It arrives one policy at a time, as this story continues. To unfold, it leaves behind an uncomfortable silence, the kind that forces reflection rather than applause. Because this is not just about beer or brands or trade statistics buried in policy documents. It is about direction, about who gets to decide the future of global markets, and who bears the cost when those decisions collide. For American viewers, this moment challenges a long-held assumption that access to the world's markets is permanent, that relationships built decades ago will always hold, that influence once earned cannot be quietly withdrawn. But history shows that global power rarely disappears overnight. It fades slowly through missed signals, ignored warnings, and choices made far away that suddenly feel very close to home. For African nations, the emotions are different. There is pride in choosing local, hope in building domestic industries, a belief that economic independence is not just a slogan but a necessity shaped by years of vulnerability to external shocks. Yet even here, the road forward is complex. Local industries must survive competition, corruption, and global pressure. Promises must turn into real jobs, real wages, and real stability, or public support will fade. And somewhere between these two realities sits the ordinary worker. The American farmer watching export orders shrink, the dock worker noticing fewer containers headed overseas, the factory employee wondering whether the next slowdown will reach their line. On the other side of the ocean, the small African distributor hoping local production truly delivers opportunity, not just new elites and new dependencies. This is how globalization feels when it changes direction. Not dramatic, not announced with sirens, but deeply personal when it finally becomes visible. The beer industry is simply the messenger, a familiar product revealing an unfamiliar future. If an iconic American brand can face resistance, then no sector is immune. Food, agriculture, manufacturing, technology all depend on trust, access, and mutual benefit. Once those pillars weaken even slightly, the entire structure begins to shift. Some will frame this as economic nationalism. Others will call it overdue correction. Many will argue about who wins and who loses. But the truth is more complicated. In a world where emerging markets are asserting themselves, old rules no longer apply cleanly. Power is being renegotiated, not seized, and adaptation matters more than outrage. The real question is not whether Africa is right or America is wrong. The real question is whether global players are willing to listen before markets close, instead of after, whether partnerships can evolve from dependency to collaboration, whether economic growth can be shared rather than extracted. Because once consumers move on, once supply chains rewire, once loyalty is built elsewhere, recovery is slow, sometimes impossible. History is filled with brands and industries that assumed permanence, only to discover that relevance must be earned again and again. So as you think about this story, ask yourself what it represents. Beyond the headlines, is this the start of a broader shift away from U.S. dominance in everyday products? Is it a strategic awakening for Africa? Or is it simply the beginning of a more competitive, less predictable global economy where no one gets guaranteed access anymore? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain. Moments like this don't end debates, they start them. And that's why your perspective matters. Is Africa making a smart long-term move by backing local industries, even if it strains old relationships? Or is America underestimating how quickly influence can slip away when markets feel taken for granted? Leave your thoughts in the comments. This conversation is far from over, and the next decision made on either side of the ocean could shape who drinks, who produces, and who profits in the years to come. As the debate grows louder, another layer of this story begins to surface, one that rarely makes headlines but quietly shapes outcomes. It is the role of perception. In global trade, perception can be as powerful as policy. Once a market starts to believe that a brand represents dependency rather than partnership, every decision around that brand is scrutinized more harshly. In many African markets, American products once carried an automatic premium. They were associated with reliability, scale, and global status. But today, that perception is evolving. Younger consumers are more conscious of where products come from, who benefits from their purchase, and whether local alternatives are being crowded out. Social media amplifies these questions, turning what was once a private purchasing choice into a public statement. This generational shift matters. Young consumers are not just buyers. They are future policymakers, entrepreneurs, and cultural influencers. When their loyalty tilts toward local brands, it reshapes demand patterns for decades. American exporters may still compete on quality, but they now face a narrative challenge, proving relevance in markets that no longer equate foreign with superior. At the same time, African governments are under pressure from their own populations. Unemployment remains one of the continent's most sensitive political issues. Leaders are expected to deliver tangible economic progress, not just growth figures. Supporting domestic industries, even imperfectly, becomes a visible way to signal commitment to national development. This is where trade decisions intersect with politics. Restricting imports or favoring local production is not only an economic choice. It is a message to voters. It says, we are prioritizing our own capacity, even if it means friction with powerful partners. In an era of rising political competition across Africa, that message carries weight. For American companies, navigating this environment requires more than competitive pricing. It demands cultural understanding, long-term investment, and genuine partnership. Simply exporting finished goods is no longer enough. Markets want skills transfer, local sourcing, and shared value creation. Without these elements, resistance grows quietly but steadily. Some U.S. brands recognize this and are attempting to adapt. They speak of localization, sustainability, and community engagement. But adaptation is expensive and slow, especially for companies built around centralized production and global scale. Every step toward local integration reduces margins and complicates operations. And even when companies adapt, trust is not immediately restored. Years of perceived imbalance cannot be erased by a single investment announcement. Credibility must be rebuilt through consistency, transparency, and patience, qualities that do not always align with quarterly earnings pressure. Meanwhile, global competition intensifies. Countries outside the traditional Western sphere are offering African nations alternative trade relationships. These partners often come with fewer conditions, faster financing, and infrastructure support tied directly to local production. While these arrangements carry their own risks, they expand Africa's options and reduce reliance on any single source. This diversification weakens the leverage that once defined global trade hierarchies. When choices increase, influence spreads thinner. For American exporters, this means negotiating rather than assuming, persuading rather than dictating, listening rather than reacting. The beer industry illustrates this reality vividly. Brewing depends on local taste, distribution networks, and cultural acceptance. A brand that fails to embed itself locally becomes vulnerable, regardless of its global reputation. Once shelf space is lost, reclaiming it is costly and uncertain. In the United States, these shifts raise uncomfortable questions about economic strategy. Should America focus more on strengthening domestic consumption to offset export volatility? Should trade policy place greater emphasis on mutual development rather than market access alone? And are American companies prepared for a world where influence must be earned continuously? For policymakers, the challenge is balancing national interests with global engagement. Responding aggressively to perceived rejection can escalate tensions and accelerate disengagement. Responding passively risks normalizing exclusion. The middle path, constructive negotiation and adaptation, requires restraint and long-term thinking. As viewers, it is easy to see this story as distant, happening across oceans and borders. But the effects ripple inward. Trade patterns shape employment, prices, and political narratives at home. They influence how nations perceive one another and how citizens understand their place in the global economy. What is unfolding now is not a final verdict on American brands, nor a guaranteed victory for local industries. It is a transition messy, uneven, and filled with uncertainty. Some strategies will succeed, others will fail. Alliances will shift, expectations will be rewritten, and perhaps that is the most important takeaway. Global trade is no longer a one-way flow. It is a negotiation among equals in the making. Africa is asserting agency. America is being forced to respond. Neither side fully controls the outcome. The question is not who will win this moment, but who will learn from it. Because in a world where markets are increasingly selective, adaptability becomes the most valuable currency of all. Brands that listen survive, those that assume fade. And nations that recognize this early shape the future, while those that don't are left reacting to decisions already made elsewhere.